Welcome to the third video of the Intro to Programming series. In this video, we'll be discussing something called a loop structure, where we're going to be covering our while loops, for loops, and two data structures called lists and tuples. And as always, at the end of the video, we'll be introducing a programming exercise to write some code and get confident in the Python that we are writing. Let's get started. So, for this video, we're going to start off talking about a repetition structure. In the previous video, we discussed that if statements were decision structures, and decision structures allowed us to make decisions and execute or not execute a code dependent on the condition of the statement. Repetition structures, therefore, allows us to repeat logic over and over and over again without having to write our code over and over and over again. So there's two loops that we're going to be going through today, while loops and for loops. What we're going to start off with is actually while loops, because while loops are condition-controlled loops. Coming off of our if statements video, we are very familiar now with what conditions are. So while loops are going to actually be extremely familiar to us, even though it is a brand new topic. So first things, I'm going to create a variable called number. And I'm going to write our first while loop. As you can see, while is another keyword, is a reserved word, so we can't use this in any other setting than to create a while loop. And actually, if we change this to an if statement, you can see that really the syntax of writing an if statement versus a while loop is simply swapping out the keyword of if with a while. So I still have the same condition, I still have the same colon. I'm going to print the number within the while loop. So similar to an if statement, the if statement would execute the block statement if the condition is true. Same thing with the while loop. A while loop will execute its block statement as long as the condition is true. So unlike an if statement where the condition is resolved once or is evaluated once, and depending on the results of that evaluation, it does or does not execute the code, a while loop will continuously evaluate the condition. And as long as the results of the evaluation return true, we will keep executing the body of the code. Now, this is going to introduce a dangerous scenario for us of something called an infinite loop, of which actually this code that I've written right now currently is. So I am not going to run this code right now because this is an infinite loop and it's going to cause some issues with Replit. So let's manually run through this real quick. So we have a variable number with the value of 0. And while number is less than 5, I'm going to be printing number. So number is 0, number is indeed less than 5, condition is resolved to a true. I'm going to print number, the number 0 shows up. Now, again, with an if statement, we would have been done with this statement if it was an if statement. But since this is a while loop, I go back up and check the condition again. The condition remains 0 is less than 5 is true. I print number, I end up with 0. I've reached the bottom of the loop, come back up to the top, check the condition, 0 is still less than 5, I print another 0, and then I reach the bottom, come back up to the top, and now you can see this infinite loop happening. The number is never going to be greater than 5. So this, as we have it written, is an infinite loop. What we need to do is add in the logic of making sure that the number is going up to 5. So this syntax, it might look a little bit new, but it is the exact same syntax of this. This is the syntax of how we would reassign a variable with 1 added to that variable all the way back in video 1. We are taking this line of code and we are just shorthanding it to this, where we no longer need to write the variable number or the variable twice, and then just taking that plus sign and moving it over here, and that's how we would be able to change that. And we can do the same thing with the subtraction, multiplication, same thing with the multiplication and division if you want as well. But there is no need for you to necessarily write your code like this. If you want to write your code as we've done previously before, that's totally fine. This is very much a personal preference rather than an efficiency decision. So now that we've reached this point where we have our logic of making sure that the number is being incremented up, this is no longer an infinite loop. Let's go ahead and write and see what we get. And you can see here, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So number is 0, number is less than 5. That is true. Jump into the body, add 1 to number, print number, so 1 gets printed. We've reached the bottom of the loop, come back up to the top. 1 is still less than 5. Jump into the body, add 1 more to the number becomes 2, print the number, and 2 gets printed, reach the bottom, go back up to the top, check the condition, and over and over and over again, until eventually we print the number when it is 5, and 5 gets printed. I go back up to the top, 5 is less than 5. That is not true. So because the condition became false, the loop broke, and now the loop is finished. The next concept that we're going to be going over is a loop called a for loop. So unlike while loops, which are called condition-controlled loops, for loops are called count-controlled loops. And the reason why it's called count-controlled loop is because for loops iterate a specific number of times. The term iterate means how many times a loop goes through its block statement. A for loop will iterate through a specific number of times. The specific number of times that it iterates is dependent on what it is looping through. So to take a look at this for loop, on line 18 and 19, we need to break this down into a couple of components. So first off, we have 2 new keywords, for and in. So those are 2 keywords that exist in Python. And again, keywords are reserved words, so we can't use them in any other setting than to create a for loop. Specifically the for keyword. The in keyword is actually a keyword that we can use in other scenarios, but it is still a keyword and a reserved word. We just happen to be using it in tandem with the for keyword. Following that, what we do recognize is number. So again, this is a variable. Specifically, this is what we call a target variable. And the target variable is just like any other variable that we have worked before. The only difference is that a target variable only exists within the context of the for loop. So this variable number is a permanent variable that exists in our Python file. This variable number here is going to only exist as long as the for loop is running. Just to resolve the confusion a little bit, I'm going to change this target variable to I. I started off the target variable as a number because what we are iterating through are these numbers. So when it says the for loop is a count controlled loop and it iterates a specific number of times, 99% of the time we are using a for loop to iterate through a sequence of values called a list. And a list is a data structure in programming that allows us to hold multiple values together in sequence. So what's going to happen with this is, as the for loop iterates, I, the target variable, is going to represent each value in this sequence. So on the first iteration, I represents 1, second iteration 2, third 4, fourth 4, and fifth 5. And just to show what that looks like, if I run this now, it'll look exactly like the previous example. But now I have these predetermined values that I am iterating through. So this list, and a list is signified by these square brackets that you see on the side, can contain as many values as we want as long as they are separated by commas. And lists can hold any type of data. And in fact, are a type themselves in that they are a list data type. So I'm going to copy over these two lists. One is the same list that we see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm storing that inside of a variable called number list. And here I have a name list where I have a list of strings, specifically strings that are people's names. And when we are using a for loop, we don't have to include the list as it is within the for loop. We can have a list stored inside of a variable and be able to iterate through that variable instead of having this being stuck in the for loop, making the code look kind of crowded. So I'm going to be pasting out two for loops that is going to iterate through both of these two lists that we just created. So comment these loops out. And now just taking a look at this loop, if I run this now, we'll see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we'll also see John, Jane, Steve, and Sarah. And this is a way for us to be able to iterate through a list from beginning to end. And that's what it means to be a count controlled loop, where a for loop understands that this list that they are iterating through has a specific number of values, and it will start at the beginning value and stop at the end. And it is absolutely vital that it stops at the last value. To discuss why it is vital for the for loop to stop at the last value, we need to understand something about lists. So lists are able to hold a sequence of values, specifically in a specified order. How does a list keep track of the order of where these values are and make sure that they stay in order? Well, lists use something called an index number to assign to every value that it is holding within the list. So here in our numbers list, there are 5 values. Name list also has 4 values. Every single one of these values have an index number associated with it. Let's use the names list to talk about what the index numbers are. Index numbers, as previously mentioned, represent each value in a list. Index numbers are not randomly signed, they are not randomized numbers, they are sequential numbers that start at 0 from the beginning of the list. So John has an index number of 0, Jane 1, Steve 2, and Sarah 3. This is the important thing to remember about index numbers is that they start at 0. So if every value in a list has an index number associated with it, what can we do with it? Well, let's see. If we print the number list and the name list, we're going to see something kind of funny. Printing the list themselves, we get to see the entirety of the list with the square brackets included. And that makes sense. We are displaying number list and name list, and that represents that entire list with all values within it. But what if I want to target a specific value in that list? Well, now that we understand what index numbers are in terms of the service that it provides for a list, we can use that to target a specific value in that list. For instance, what if I only want to print the name Steve? Rather than printing the entire name list, I just want to print the name Steve. What do I need to know? Well, we know that the Steve value has an index number of 2 associated with it, right? 0, 1, 2, 3. Steve has an index number of 2. Knowing that index number, I can target that specific value. The way that I target a specific value in a list is to one, reference the variable that the list is stored in, followed by a square bracket. So similarly of how the square bracket allows us to create a list and contain values inside of it, putting these square brackets after the variable of the list allows us to put the index number in it to target the specific value. So again, to print Steve, I am going to be printing the names list at index 2. And now if I run this again, you'll see rather than seeing the entire list themselves, I only see the names list at index 2. Part of why we're talking about index is because we mentioned that it is vital that the for loop end at the last value in a list. What if I try to manually access a value that does not exist? Name list only goes up to the index 3. What if I try to access index 5 and I run my file? What do I get? Well, we run into our first programming error, for our first syntax error. We get a message called index error list index out of range. So when working with a list, we need to be absolutely careful of making sure that we are not trying to access a value in a list that does not exist. Because in Python, if you try to access a value in the list that does not exist, specifically if you're trying to use an index number that is out of bounds of the index numbers that they have for the list, we will run into an error and your program will break. Now that we have discussed what a list is and how a list acts, let's talk about tuples. So tuples are another data structure that is extremely similar to lists. The only difference is that a tuple is what we call an immutable data structure. So you can see here I have these two variables, name list and name tuple. They look almost exactly the same. The only difference is obviously lists use square brackets, but tuples use parentheses. And that's how we can create a list or a tuple. So a list is a mutable ordered data structure, right? It's a sequence of values. We know that index numbers allow us to keep these values in order, and it is mutable in that I can add and remove values from these lists if I want to. Tuples are also a ordered data structure, so they also use index numbers just like how lists do, but they are immutable. So once a tuple is created, I cannot add or remove any values. This is how the tuple will be forever and ever. But outside of the fact that lists are immutable and lists are mutable and tuples are immutable, they operate extremely similarly. So instead of iterating through a name list, I can quite literally just swap the variable from name list to name tuple. And even here, change the nameless tuple and access an index that actually does exist, and when I run it, it all works exactly the same. I was still able to iterate through a name tuple and print out all of the 4 names. I could still use an index number to target a specific value in the name tuple, specifically Sarah, which is the last value in the tuple, and be able to do the exact same things that we did in lists that we did with tuples. So to recap our video, what we've talked about today are while loops. While loops are what we call condition-controlled loops that allows us to repeat the body of our logic as long as the condition remains true. And once the condition becomes false, then the loop finishes. A for loop, on the other hand, is a count-controlled loop. And a for loop is basically a loop that is designed to iterate through a sequence of values. The sequence of values that we learned are lists and tuples. And again, lists and tuples are extremely similar. The only difference is that a list is a mutable ordered data structure that holds a sequence of values and uses indexes to keep track of those values. Tuples are immutable ordered data structure that hold values and use index numbers to target specific values. So the only difference between lists and tuples is that lists can change in size and that there are values that we can add or remove if we wish to. Tuples, on the other hand, once created, we cannot add or remove any values from the tuple. And as always, to round off our video, I'm going to be talking about 2 programming exercises that you should attempt. So there are 2 problems today, both of them to have an example using a while loop and a for loop. So for the while loop, I want you to try to create a while loop to create a countdown program that displays 10 to 1. So this is going to be a little bit of a stretch because what we did in our example is we did a count up. So we printed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if all of this code is a way for us to count up from 1 to 5, you're going to have to kind of reverse this logic a little bit to create a while loop where you count 10 to 1. And then secondly, using a for loop, iterate through and display a list of colors that you created. So this is going to allow us the practice of creating a list. It doesn't have to be a list of colors. That's just the example that I came up with. You can have multiple lists as well if you wish to create, but I think creating a list and storing it in a variable and being able to use a for loop to iterate through a list and display those values will help you immensely in getting comfortable with utilizing for loops. But that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching.